Hi, everybody. Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 2. My name is Bob Judson, and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really, really hope you enjoy what follows. Well, this week, Leading for Life Stories goes international, and my guest is Stephen Moore, a former Congressional Chief of Staff in the United States, who's a political strategist, international social entrepreneur, and a public opinion researcher. He's worked in more than a dozen countries, including Iraq, East Timor, Democratic Republic of Congo, just to name but three. And he has a very, very interesting perspective on all things America and more broadly across the world. I first came across Stephen when he was part of a panel presentation for the Leaders Club. And he provided some fascinating perspectives on the US and where that is heading with the election this year and the challenges that obviously it faces in common with much of the rest of the world at the moment. He's also very, very heavily involved as president of the Ukraine Freedom Project and is obviously spending a lot of time in Ukraine. He lives there for a significant chunk of time. And as a result, has a lot of very strong views on what is happening there, as you'd expect. So it was a fascinating interview, and I really hope you enjoy what comes from it. And here we go. Hey, Stephen, fantastic to have you on the podcast. I'm really, really grateful for your time. I know you're an extremely busy man, and I feel very privileged to have you today, but thanks very much.
Sure, happy to be here.
I want to get started with just a brief intro to you, because you've had an amazing career in the US political arena, and you continue obviously to be extremely active in US politics, as well as, and we're obviously going to talk a lot more about this, doing what you do with the presidency of the Ukraine Freedom Project. But just to get us started, could you give us a summary of your kind of career to date? Because what I try and do on these podcasts is very much talk about leadership in the round with the people I interview, and I'd love to have some more perspective on your overall journey.
Sure. Yeah. Whenever I was young, I like to do two things. I like to do political campaigns and I like to travel. And political campaigns are set up for that because, on the first Tuesday of November is when election day is. And whether you've done a good job or not, your job is finished. And so the life of a political consultant runs into your cycles. So I was able to go work on a campaign and then go travel someplace. Then in 1996, I got the opportunity to combine those two. I worked on a campaign in Russia for Boris Yeltsin. And Russia was a no less crazy, but slightly more nice place at that time. And so I spent 5 months in Moscow working on Boris Yeltsin's reelection campaign in 1996. And it was a life-changing, formative experience, super interesting. And then I went to San Diego, spent some time in the San Diego mayor's office, got a graduate degree, a global MBA from a school called Thunderbird. And then 2001 happened. And September 11th, I'd gotten my MBA. I was working for 6 months for a management consulting firm, the oldest management consulting firm in the world, Arthur D. Little. And within 6 months of me getting there, the oldest management consulting firm in the world filed Chapter 11. And that was 3 weeks to the day before September 11th. And at that point, I decided I wanted to do something to help. And so I started working in Muslim countries to try to help them figure out how to solve their problems using words rather than guns and bombs. And so that took me a few years. And then I ended up on Capitol Hill for about 7 years, working as a chief of staff to a member of the House of Representatives, and a member of leadership for a while. So he was the number 4 person in the House of Representatives. And then I left that. Washington, D.C. is really fun until it is not. And so it ceased to be fun at some point. I left, came back to San Diego, spent some time here, and then got a job in doing public opinion research for the largest news organization in Ukraine. Did that for about a year, loved it, thought Kyiv was a wonderful city, loved my Ukrainian friends, and coincidentally got a job with an American artificial intelligence company that had about 500 Ukrainian employees. Did that for 2.5 years and left on January 31st last year. And then, of course, on February 24th, the Russians invaded Ukraine, and I didn't have a gig. I was like, just wanting to relax and chill out. And it's 2.5 years on this AI startup hamster wheel was a lot. And so, but my friends started saying things to me like, they're bombing Kyiv. I don't know what to do. And so I had spent nearly 2 years in Iraq after 2001. So, it's like, I've been to Baghdad. I lived there. How much worse could Ukraine be? So I hopped on the plane, got there on day 5 of the war, and started trying to help. And I've been helping ever since.
Wow. I mean, that is just an amazing set of experiences. I mean, the Boris Yeltsin thing, I had no idea you'd done that. It's extraordinary. And then I guess to almost go full circle, to look back on Russia now, when you're looking at it very much from a Ukrainian perspective, I mean, that must be quite tricky. I guess you've got quite a lot of Russian friends as well.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing is I found the Russians to be very arrogant for no particular reason. And I think that bears true now. This is in 1996. I was working with the top leaders in the country. And, there was days when you couldn't dial a telephone number starting with the number 2 because it just didn't work. And so, they're very arrogant, very superior, very proud people. And they don't really have a reason to be because, Russia is a basket case on a good day. And so that experience really gives me insight into the mindset of what's happening now with the Russians in Ukraine.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to come back and talk more about Ukraine later on. But before we get there, I'd just be interested in you individually. And I mean, you mentioned obviously travel and politics and so on at the beginning, but early motivations, what was it that really kind of motivated you to get started into that? And what were your kind of formative things that shape what you do now?
Yeah, curiosity, basically. I was always very curious about what was really happening. And what I found was that you can't find out what's really happening until you go there. And I started out life as a journalism major and then switched to politics. And, but it's sort of two sides of the same coin. I got a job in the House of Representatives, the chief of staff. And the really exciting thing for me was I get to find out what's really happening in Congress. So, I've always had a strong desire, to, people tell you things, you hear things on the news media, and you scratch your head and you're like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's go find out what's really happening. So.
Yeah, and I can completely see how you've got, I mean, with the travel and just what you've described a minute ago from Russia to Iraq to Ukraine and obviously US, I mean, all are continue to be interesting places, not all for good reasons. And actually, as you say, I completely agree. If you've been on the ground and understand what's going on there, Afghanistan is a good example for me, where I spent a chunk of time there in the military. And, often when I talk to people about it, that they'll have a view which they've got from social media, the media, whatever it happens to be. And sometimes that's reasonably accurate, but a lot of the time it's way off the mark. So yeah, I totally buy that.
Yeah, it's like Ukraine's a great example. I have a lot of people arguing with me about what's going on in Ukraine. I'm like, look, I've been to the front 12 times. I can call someone right now who was at the front. And, so maybe I have a little bit more information than, whoever you've been listening to on the internet, Tucker Carlson's a good example of someone who says things about Ukraine that are grossly inaccurate. And I've never seen Tucker in Ukraine.
Yeah, it is frustrating when that happens, isn't it? And I think actually even when, again, I got to leverage your experience with my Afghanistan example, because when I was there commanding Kandahar airfield, we had loads of political visitors who came out obviously from the UK, but also from the US actually. And it was interesting to see how their perspectives changed to some degree, but also then they get back and they get swept along in the kind of mainstream requirement almost to be conforming to a particular narrative in some instances. And that is frustrating. And are you seeing a similar sort of thing with what you're describing there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Listen, I even get swept up in it. I've been back in the United States since early November. We had planned to come here in early November and stay for 3 weeks. But with everything that's going on with this bill, it made more sense for me to be in DC. And we've met with about 70 members of Congress in the past 3 months. And, and I have to go check back in, make sure that, hold it. What do I remember? What do my friends in Ukraine say? Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, good. Because the influence of the media is pervasive. And, there's two types of media here in Ukraine or here in USA. There's there's three. There's the media that does not cover it. There's the media that does cover it and says, today something blew up in Ukraine. And so everyone thinks that the only thing happening in Ukraine is things are blowing up. And then there's the media that gives Russian talking points. So it's really difficult to get good information about Ukraine. And thank you, by the way, for your service in Afghanistan. That was a rough neighborhood.
Yeah, it was an interesting time, that's for sure. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm extremely glad I did it, but I'm equally glad that, I didn't do it, a million times or spend too much time there. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these conflicts that we've been involved in, and a lot of the time, obviously, in fact, almost invariably, have been alongside US military doing those sorts of activities. Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan are the ones that I was mostly involved in, and yeah, you're inevitably in the military. You're working at the behest of your government. I mean, it's interesting in a not very nice way to be watching as an observer, I guess, with what's happening in Ukraine, with the realization that we'd thought that state-on-state warfare at the end of the Cold War, this was probably something that was almost in the past, and now obviously it's definitely not that. It's obviously not the case. Clearly, and we might as well go there now, actually, in terms of a discussion. I mean, I find it fascinating in the context of US politics that the US is the backbone of NATO. I mean, there's no question about that. It funds the vast majority of NATO activity and has done for many years. And I know that's caused, rightly, a lot of annoyance, probably putting it mildly, in the US about other countries in NATO not necessarily stepping up to the mark. The end of the Cold War obviously allowed a big peace dividend, in inverted commas, drawdown of armed forces and so on and so forth, that changed the direction a little bit particularly in terms of US presence in Europe, which is obviously a fraction of what it used to be. But we're now facing a whole kind of new challenge in Europe, potentially, which is going to have a global impact without a shadow of a doubt if it gets worse. And at the same time, on your side of the Atlantic, we've got a kind of political situation where Donald Trump's, on record, I think very clearly is saying, he would want to exit NATO. Whether he would actually do that, I think is a question I'd be interested in your perspective on.
Listen, if I could predict what's going on in Donald Trump's head, I would be making a lot more money than I am now.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people, isn't it? And I guess there's a difference maybe between some of the rhetoric and what would actually happen in reality. But I do see the trend is obviously for a bit more isolationism from the US side, right?
Yeah, definitely. My organization, the Ukraine Freedom Project, did a poll of Republican voters, of the hardcore people that vote every time for the Republican. We have what we call primary elections, which is the election that decides, which Republican goes and faces the Democrat in November. And and every seat in Congress right now is a safe Republican or a safe Democrat seat. So all of the action, all of the change in Congress comes from these primary elections. And so only about 15 to 20% of America votes in them. And they're usually the most extreme 15 to 20% of Americans. And that's part of the reason why we have such the polarization problem that we have today. The Ukraine Freedom Project polled the Republican primary voters and found some interesting things. One, definitely a sense of isolationism. Why is this our problem? Why is this our war? We have problems here at home, which is to some degree true. The southern border right now is a tremendous security risk. And, I spend all my time trying to educate policymakers and members of Congress about the importance of supporting Ukraine. But at the same time, there's far more people today that came across the U.S. southern border than came across any of Ukraine's borders. And, they're not necessarily people that are here to pursue the American dream. There's tons of fentanyl. There's not just, Salvadorans, Mexicans, Guatemalans. There are people from countries all over the world, some of which have the desire to do us harm. And so that is a real problem. But, in my view, you can do both. So, and just some additional insight into the Republican primary voter, they are 97% think the world's unstable, 80% think the world is very unstable. We ask the question, agree, disagree with the terrible wars in Ukraine and Israel. Sometimes I worry about World War III. That's an 81% agreement on that statement. When you talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, that gets their attention. And, they understand that these countries are a coalition against America and the Western world. And really, I would say the civilized world, the part of the world that cares about human life. And so that gives you some sense of it. And in general, I'm finding that Americans are living under the illusion that we have a choice as to whether or not to participate in these wars in Europe and the Middle East. And the choice is not a yes or no choice. The choice is when. And do we want to participate now and send weapons, which are relatively inexpensive, or do we want to participate later and send troops, which are going to be wildly expensive in ways that are just not even financial? So, you're going to see American men and women die, and nobody wants that. And we can stave that off now with the relatively inexpensive choice of sending weapons to Ukraine and Israel.
Yeah, no, does make sense. I mean, I think it's interesting. With any of my previous guests, I haven't talked about the sort of Israel-Gaza situation, but that very much in the news here in the UK is the kind of US perspective on Israel and Israel's actions. And pretty much every day, talking about US pressure to Israel to pay more attention to civilian casualties and those sorts of things. But clearly, everyone knows a very, very strong Jewish lobby, etc., in the US that is clearly influencing the way that this plays. And obviously, Israel is almost wholly reliant on US support. If the US backed away from support, they'd be in a really parlous situation. What's that look like from your side of the Atlantic, though, in terms of is the sort of support wholeheartedly for Israel still in what's going on there, or is that because that's clearly been a diversion from Ukraine as well, right? That's challenged that it's sort of split the narratives a little bit, and we're not very good at having multifaceted conflicts in most places.
Well, I'm friends with some of the pro-Israel folks in Washington D.C. and they don't, and neither they nor the pro-Ukraine folks view it as a competitive situation. On the contrary, the first place that Hamas went after they invaded Israel was Russia. And so, like the next week, they went to Russia. Many of them were educated in Russian universities. And shortly thereafter, Russia hosted a summit of, Iran and Hamas. And on the flip side, Iran is sending drones to Russia, and Russia is using those to kill civilians in Ukraine. And so what we're seeing, which is the folks that are, monitoring these wars and educating Congress on these wars, is that, they're all in the same front. There are different fronts in the same war. And, again, what we've got China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia all working together to cause chaos and horror in the world. Again, I'll just give you a few more examples. China is sending all kinds of stuff to Russia. Russia at this point is essentially a client state of China. And the Ukrainians, amazingly, about 2 weeks ago, blew up both of the main rail connections between Russia and China. And it's deep inside Russia. Those guys are really good. North Korea is sending weapons to Russia. They're not very good weapons, and sometimes the shells blow up inside their howitzers. So, my view is like, how can we get North Korea to send more artillery to Russia? but this is what's happening. These countries are working together to cause all of these problems. And America believes that the vast oceans between us and China and us and Europe are going to keep us safe. But that's not the way the world works anymore. And there's a really interesting movie, Leave the World Behind, on Netflix with Julia Roberts. And it is a show that it gives a vision of how an attack in the United States may happen, which is largely a cyber attack, taking out our infrastructure, destroying our communications capacity, and taking over various automated systems in the United States and doing terrible things with it. And so, that rings true to me. I used to work in Congress. We used to read these reports of how our infrastructure was incredibly vulnerable. We use just-in-time logistics for our food, meaning that at any given time in America, and I'm making this up at this point, but like 5 days of food supply. There's a very limited supply of food in the United States. It gets really ugly really quickly if someone starts screwing around with it.
Yeah, and that's been brought to really sharp relief, hasn't it, with just in the last few days, Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, for example, and a lot of discussion on the UK news, certainly about what's the, obviously shipping companies changing routes and saying they're not going to use the Red Sea, they're not going to use the Suez Canal, therefore longer transit times and increased costs and all the sort of knock-on that goes from that, which, and as you say, those just-in-time supply chains, I mean, our public tolerance, I think in any, your country just as mine, actually, for things not working. So we were joking before we came on air about UK power cuts and that sort of thing, which years ago that would have been, no one would have blinked about it. But now it's a much more irritant thing that gets under people's skin very, very quickly. The internet going down is almost worse because everyone is so reliant on it. And therefore the vulnerability around cyber and things like that is bad. And I mean, Amazon, certainly here, I did it yesterday. I needed something, I ordered it, and it arrived today. We're kind of getting to a point where you've got an absolute expectation. What do you mean it hasn't arrived? That's completely unacceptable. Whereas, of course, in years gone by, certainly you would never even have dreamed of expecting those kind of delivery timelines. And so I think it is tricky to row back from that and kind of get to a public perception of things may actually be a bit different if things go further down the sort of areas of challenge that we might all face in years ahead. And that's before we get into a conversation about climate or anything else, actually.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And so we have optimized the world for low cost, high production, ease of commerce, which it means it's not optimized for security. And, and if everybody's playing nice in the world, that's a good thing. And when you have a strong America with strong partners like Britain, then you've got, a hegemon that'll make sure everything is okay. And if someone behaves badly, they will get negative results from it. But we seem to have lost our way in that, America doesn't want to be the world's policeman. Well, it doesn't get better without, someone taking that role. And because if, power abhors a vacuum and, you can, and, so who steps up next into that role that America deserts? Is it China? Probably. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's Europe? Can Europe fulfill that role?
No, I think Europe's still firmly looking at the US. It was interesting. So one of my previous guests on this was General David Petraeus. And we talked a bit about the US and the kind of political situation. And I'd really be interested in your perspective on this, actually, because his view was that, we've got this kind of political divide and stuff at the minute. But, the reality is we will still need to be in the front row of pretty much everything that's a major tension point around the world in order to turn around and make sure some of these things don't become much more significant problems. And I think from a European perspective, and obviously it's a personal opinion, but I think that's very much still the view that the expectation is the US will kind of turn up and lead the way. And I can remember actually, interestingly, I was in the Pentagon when I was still in the military. I did a job for 9 months in 2011, and was the UK Chief of Defence Staff's liaison to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And it was 2011 was when the Libya campaign happened. And that pretty much all unfolded as I was arriving. It was just starting, but then the vast majority of it was during my time there. And the whole conversation was, from a Pentagon point of view and from a US political point of view, we're kind of bored with being the ones that are always in the front of this. But we recognize that actually to make it work as a campaign, we have to be providing at least the enabling assets. So the tankers and the anti-radiation capability and the electronic countermeasures capability and a lot of the support. And we probably need to be there to kick the door in on the first couple of nights, just to turn around and really eliminate a lot of the threats that are potentially there, to enable other allies and the sort of wider coalition to do that. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. I mean, Operation Odyssey Dawn was the American operation for that. And they did that. And they described it amusingly as leading from behind, which made a lot of sense, actually. But it was still, the operation would have been completely different without the US involvement, without a shadow of a doubt. On kicking the ball back to you slightly on this, though, I mean, that was 2011, and a lot's changed since then. And I've been to the US many, many times, both socially and obviously professionally. And I've never seen your country so divided. And I've got a lot of American friends who sit on both sides of that divide, actually, and it's sad to witness. And I just wonder what your perspective is on how bad that is now, and is it going to get worse before it gets better? Is it healable? What's the sort of prognosis?
All good questions, and I can talk to you about the forces that are dividing us somewhat. We mentioned earlier that the polarization in Congress is because, in part, because the people that draw the maps for Congress, everybody's got a district, right? And a member of Congress, member of the House of Representatives, represents about 700,000 people. And so you've got to draw those maps so everybody gets the same amount of voters in the state. And the people that draw the maps draw them in a partisan fashion, because there's been the belief for decades that, I would rather have a safe Republican or safe Democrat seat than have to run in an election against a Republican or a Democrat, someone from the opposite party every year. So what that's done is led to the extremities in the House of Representatives. Social media divides us, right? I used to, think about it this way. In the United States, in the 70s, we had 3 news channels, 4 if you counted CBS. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC, and you couldn't watch all 3 because they all happened at 6:00 in the evening. So, so you had to pick one, and they were only half an hour, and people trusted the news media then. And not many people know this, but to get Spectrum to broadcast on, ABC, NBC, and CBS had to agree as a public service to broadcast at least a half an hour of news. So, when news started, it was a public service. Now it is a profit center, and that started in the 80s with CNN. So at one point, there was not a lot of news. It was very high quality production for a very small amount of news. And now people, will listen to anybody because there's 50 channels that have 24 hours of news a day, and they just need some content. And so they're not super picky about what they put on the air. And, the smart ones have figured out, they've done public opinion research, as I have done for a living in the past. And they say, people are interested in this. Let's feed them what they want, rather than here's the reality. Let's tell them what the reality is. It's like, people want to hear this. Let's reinforce that so that they will watch our news more frequently, click on the links that we put out on the internet, and we will make more money. So those are some of the forces that are dividing us. Another one is Russian propaganda. If we'd had the conversation about Russian propaganda 2 years ago before I went to Ukraine, I'd be like, yeah, but man, those guys are good. It's very insidious, and it creeps into our news ecosphere, and they are putting things there to divide us. And so I can talk for days about what they're talking about with Ukraine. It's just utterly false, and how they're doing it. But so when I tell you about these forces that are dividing Americans, I don't know when they stop. And, when do we come up with a better way to draw maps in Congress that optimize for swing seats that are competitive for both Republicans and Democrats, so that you have to appeal to both Republicans and Democrats to win, rather than safe seats where you have to appeal to the most extreme wing of your party. When are we going to change that mapping system? I don't know. When is social media going to stop putting everyone in their own little bubble to give them, news that reinforces their worldview? I don't know. When are we going to come up with a way to make news more accurate rather than more saleable? I don't know. So I am not super optimistic.
Oh, yeah, that's cheery. Especially as you go into an election year with all the obvious challenges that you've got, and without delving too much into the kind of where that's likely to end up. I mean, just give us a couple of minutes on that, because I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic when you look at the challenges with Biden, assuming Biden does run. I mean, he's obviously got all the age accusations and so on that keep getting leveled at him. Trump clearly seems to be way ahead in the kind of Republican nomination polls, but it's not clear and free yet. And certainly, again, in the UK news just yesterday, they were talking about Colorado, for example, turning around and saying they're not going to let him. He cannot be president. And all of this obviously adds to huge amounts of constitutional. Is that allowable? Does it make a difference? Can he actually be president even if he's been convicted of felonies, etc.? What do you think about the kind of, not just the Trump specific stuff, but the overall dynamic about where 24 is going to go?
Well, Bob, we have 300 and some million Americans here, and we have selected the two least popular Americans to run for president. So, yeah.
It is one of the challenges. It's one of the anachronisms of your system, I think, that you end up with. I mean, it seems to me as an external that, if you look at the US, in order to even be vaguely in a position to run for president, you have got to, if not personally, you've got to have millions and millions of personal wealth or even more. But you've certainly got to have access to it. I mean, you've got to have access to billions of campaign funds to be able to do it. And so it's certainly not an egalitarian level playing field in any way, shape or form, is it, to turn around and get to be in that kind of that game?
Well, and that's a matter of economics. When I think people say, "Oh, you got to be personally wealthy or have access to billions." It sounds like sounds dirtier than it actually is, because you got to run a campaign in 50 states, and here in California, where I'm sitting right now, a statewide campaign to talk to every voter, and what you've got to do if you want to run for president, and it's $50 million anyway. And, that's like jacks or better. That's going to get you started. And, and so America's a big place. You've got to communicate with everybody, and nobody's giving you television access for free. No one is giving you, free mail, to talk to people. You can't, as one individual, go have a conversation with everyone in America, right? So it's just an expensive endeavor to undertake. And so, but, back to our current presidential election, Biden, only 27% of voters want Biden to run again. Only 32% want Trump to run again. And, these are stunning numbers. There's nothing to compare them to past presidents, because no one's ever asked that question. And so the fact we've been asking the question is stunning. And so Nikki Haley is the most popular politician in America right now. And she has like 31% positives and 31% negatives. Every other major politician in America has higher negatives than positives. So it is a real grim situation of the leadership that's emerged. Again, I think Nikki Haley is the politician with the best chance of taking out Trump, and it's a long shot. But if she can coalesce the anti-Trump vote, and if she can get rid of DeSantis, if she can get rid of Chris Christie and some of the other ones, and make herself the last person standing against Trump, there's a lot of people who will help her. And so at that point, she will be very well funded. And then just this matter of how much can we get Trump to say that reminds people that why they don't like him? Because the more he talks, the lower his poll numbers gets. And he's been busy with multiple lawsuits in multiple states. And when he doesn't talk, people think, oh yeah, Trump would do better. Trump would do better. But Trump has a gift for reminding people why they don't like him. And so I think that, the more Trump talks, the less popular he gets. And so how can we get him out there more?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, the one thing, it's not going to be as boring, right? I mean, over the next year, I think it's amazing. And I look in our country. I mean, the political situation is equally pretty fraught, really, with a conservative government that's been in power for unparalleled levels of time. I don't think it's ever happened that we've had one government winning 5 elections in a row, which they would have to do if they were going to come back into government after the next election. And it looks pretty unlikely. But at the same time, you've got an opposition who hasn't got, by any measure, clear plans that everyone can turn around and coalesce behind and say, yeah, okay, there's a definitive reason for voting them in. So it's a really interesting time here too. I have to say, every time I kind of look at it from a UK point of view, I then go, yeah, but look at our problems are nothing compared to what's going on your side. So, it's definitely not going to be dull. Brilliant. No, it's a really, really, really interesting kind of excursion down what you're currently doing. Looping back to the Ukraine bit before we go back maybe to some more personal stuff about you. I mean, obviously it's harrowing to watch the situation. And I mean, I've never been in the country. You clearly have got lots of friends there and have lived there for a lengthy period of time. I mean, what's your perspective of what's going to actually happen, how it's going to end, and where the sort of next steps are?
Well, that's a question with a lot of pendant variables, and which is how's it going to end? Well, it depends on whether the U.S. sends weapons, whether the UK sends weapons, and the global coalition supporting Ukraine maintains its integrity. Does what happens in Russia? There's a lot of dependence on that. But right now, I've been getting messages from my friends at the front, and they're running out of munitions. They're running out of optimism. The debate in the United States about whether or not to continue to support Ukraine has already done a lot of damage, because those are people, I got to tell you, man, every time I talk to a Ukrainian, at the front or elsewhere, they're just, thank you. If it wasn't for your weapons, if it wasn't for your country, we would not have a country right now. And so they're bolstered by the international support, just on a psychological and morale level. And they see that evaporating, and it's a real blow to them. There's someone texting me today saying that there's a chance that the Russians could break through in Avdiivka and some of the places around that. And, if that happens, I'd like to see it happen sooner rather than later, because maybe it could change the conversation in Congress in the United States about, whether or not to support Ukraine. Something needs to happen. And so here is, I think, the trajectory we're on now is that, the international coalition supporting Ukraine dissolves. Ukraine stops getting support. Russia rolls through Ukraine. And then you have tens of millions of people who are under Russian occupation. And the Russians in the occupied areas are already doing the worst things in the world. They're using rape as a weapon of war, including with children. Religion has become a big aspect of this war, and they are systematically persecuting Protestants in the occupied areas because they see them as an American religion, and they must be agents of the American government. They're kidnapped. We've identified 19,000 children that they've kidnapped, and there's probably up to 100,000. So all the worst things in the world that you can imagine are happening in the occupied territories, and those will be opened up into Ukraine. So then that puts Russia on the borders with the Baltic states, with Poland, all of which are NATO countries. And I've talked to many people in the United States, including members of Congress, who say that, oh, Russia will never go into a NATO country. And, a lot of those people said, oh, Russia will never go into Ukraine. And you just got to listen to what Vladimir Putin says. Vladimir Putin has been very clear and very specific that after he's done Ukraine, he's going to go into Poland. And, he's going to go into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And if you don't believe him, believe those people, because they're putting massive amounts of their GDP and their defense infrastructure into Ukraine so that they can end the war in Ukraine rather than have it on their doorstep. So, again, talking heads here in America say that Russia will never go to a NATO country. The NATO countries that are on the border don't agree with that. So, it just gets real ugly real soon.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I mean, when I was still serving in the sort of latter part of my career, actually, I remember frequent conversations with particularly the Baltic states and senior players from the Baltic states who were, they had clearly joined NATO for the Article 5 guarantee with NATO, the collective security guarantee. And that was a really big thing for them. And they were sort of obsessing about, would we actually honor it? And of course it's a big gamble, but clearly it's a big gamble from a Putin point of view that, okay, I could go and invade, maybe not a big state like Poland, but a small one like Latvia. Is that really going to cause an Article 5 trigger for the rest of the Western alliance in NATO? Say, right, we're all in poker terms to turn around and protect you. I mean, the theory is, of course, absolutely that's what it means, because that's what the treaty says, and that's the obligation that is on our countries. I think that there's a probably slightly different conversation to be had about, is there really the political stomach to do that? And are we really prepared to potentially end up in a nuclear conflagration over it? Which, back, I cut my teeth in the Cold War out as a Jaguar pilot out in Germany when, the Warsaw Pact was alive and well and we had a border down through the middle of Germany and so on. And, and certainly in those days, when I look at the nature of the military tension that was there and the preparations that we had on both sides, the absolute expectation was this could seriously happen. And the deterrent posture was ready for that to happen. I think the challenge now, of course, is the deterrent posture is less robust. What's happened over a good many years now is we've atrophied across pretty much all the Western nations, maybe the US probably less so, but even the US, I think, has done this a bit. We're a fraction of where we were at the end of the Cold War in terms of numbers, and particularly in conventional capability. We've still got the nuclear capability for the nuclear powered states or nuclear armed states, but the gap between your high end conventional capability and your stepping into the nuclear world is much, much bigger now. So then the kind of price of entry into that suddenly becomes really extreme, because you go into it's a real this is Armageddon.
Yeah.
So I can completely see why anyone that has got a border directly with Russia would feel absolutely that threat, because is NATO really going to do what it says, and is it properly going to come to our aid? I'd like to think the answer is yes. I mean, as a 34-year military veteran, I think that's absolutely what we signed up to and what we should be doing. But of course, we're at the behest of our political masters and all these sorts of things. Hey, Stephen, I'd like to switch back a bit, because we've had that's a fascinating discussion, and we could definitely. I'd like to have a part 2 with you. I think maybe at some point, maybe next year, when the American election thing starts to get sort of fully up and running, that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
But on a personal level, what I like to do with all my guests is talk about personal leadership journeys and things, and role models.
Yeah.
Who's been a particular sort of shaping character for you over your career?
So my father was a big role model. My father was a very well-known, highly regarded political consultant in California. And so I learned from him. And, some fathers and sons went out and played baseball, or, played catch with the baseball, and we watched focus groups. So and he was a brilliant man and always a big thinker. So I owe a lot to him. And there's a lot of people, who've stepped up in my life and shown me things at crucial times that I needed to see. And so in terms of role models, I can't think of, famous people that I thought I want to be that guy, but I do have a lot of people I've had a lot of mentors and a lot of people that have shown me the right thing to do and the right path to be on at places when I need to have that information.
Yeah, we all need that, don't we? That's for sure. And I think, I talk quite a lot about put my personal kind of leadership style has been shaped over the years by people I've worked for, watched, not necessarily, been directly in their teams, but I've watched them from afar and either liked what they've done or hated what they've done and taken the bits accordingly. So, some things I've lifted to do myself and some things I've said I'm never going to do that. I think we all end up shaping ourselves a little bit like that. What about leadership traits and values and things then? What are the things that are, not just for you personally, but for the people that you're working around you? I mean, you're working, and even now, you're working a lot in the political arena where some of the time there are some challenging areas in here in politics in terms of ethics and behaviors and so on. But I'd be really interested in your take on what do you think is really important, what shines.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, integrity. Integrity is important. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. And for me, when someone's working with me, if they're working hard, and trying their best, then I have a lot of grace for those people. I mean, if you screw up, were you trying hard? Did you do the best you could? Okay, didn't work. Try something else. What frustrates me is people that don't, are lackadaisical or not paying attention, or because look, one of the things that I figured out is that I am. I'm relatively smart and I work really hard. And so that's what gives me advantage in life. And so if you're not working really hard, then I think you're missing out on a big part of the formula. And so that's, I've got it's a classic Protestant work ethic, and so, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge that though, isn't it? Because I think I spend quite a lot of time doing leadership training and facilitation work for various organizations now. And they're quite often, particularly the middle management up to senior management, are looking at kind of, modern generation youngsters coming in with perhaps grew up in the pandemic and sort of stepped into the world of work during the pandemic and have therefore got very much hybrid working in their kind of blood as opposed to it never used to be that way, and have got quite a different approach and quite a different value set to what's expected in terms of hours that they're going to put in and so on and so forth. It's going to be interesting, I think, over time to see how that plays out for them as individuals as to whether that really is sustainable, that you can turn around and say, well, actually, I'm going to have my kind of really nice, comfortable work-life balance, if you want to call it that, with it properly balanced, as opposed to what most of us have experienced, where in order to actually make progress and get on in life, then you've got to work bloody hard in order to get there. And everyone that's successful is, when you look at people that have done that, almost whatever their career, they haven't done that by sitting on their hands and being idle. There are very, very few people who can claim that as a trait. So I think it's going to be interesting to see which way that plays out. I don't know what your perspective is. You seeing a similar thing over your side of the Atlantic?
Yeah, I completely agree. There's this entitlement among some sectors of the society, and the younger people, do seem to feel like, why should I have to do this? I have a college degree, so and whereas I always, I was like, what more can I learn? How can I work harder and learn more? And so I think that's the hallmark of successful people, and some of the stuff that concerns me is that I read an article, and I can't say, this is like some bulletproof study, but the most popular thing that American children want to be is an Instagram influencer. And, it's not a scientist, not an astronaut, not, an engineer or a business leader. It's, I want to be an Instagram influencer, which is, I'm glad we have those people, but they are not the backbone of a strong and productive society, and
yeah, it's fascinating. I was having exactly that conversation with somebody just earlier today about who would have thought you would ever be able to describe influencer as a career. And I know it is. I mean, there are clearly people who do that very successfully, and I'm not decrying them at all. But I just think it's such a shift in the way we kind of we operate and think about stuff. It's amazing, really. So one of the other things I like to talk about with my guests is highs and lows across careers, particularly as many of my guests have had, as just as you have, a long, really varied, very successful career. What would you do differently if you were kind of had your time again, as it were?
I don't know. I mean, got into a better university or yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, there's, I would have gone to Harvard. I don't know. but, I don't know if that option was available to me. But I mean, what I learned is that when you are, because I didn't go to Harvard, I had to, I went to a state school and I had to rely on, again, hard work and charm to get where I'm at. And so what I learned was that increase your tolerance for frustration, and so whenever someone says no to you, maybe you just haven't asked them enough times, and maybe you haven't asked them the right way. And, someone really early in my career said, you have a problem, can you go through the problem? Can you go over the problem? Can you go under the problem? Can you go around the problem? And so I think that that's aided me, is that, when, rather than giving up at a certain point, don't give up, see what happens if you keep trying. And so that's been really helpful to me. And in ninth grade, when I was 14 years old, Becky Pollard, my teacher at that time, I was fortunate enough to be in a gifted and talented class. And Becky Pollard told us that you can do anything you can do anything that someone tells you can't, right? So obviously, you can't commit armed robbery because it's against the law. But tax evasion is against the law. But what can you do? How do you how are you limiting yourself? There's self-limiting beliefs that people have, and so what do you believe about a particular situation that is holding you back? And Becky Pollard said, don't hold yourself back. You can do anything that someone tells you. Do anything until you get up to something that is expressly prohibited. So, that's something I've always thought, I've got to really work hard to color inside the line and have an ethical career. But getting up to that line, and again, it's not really necessarily about ethics. It's about what is it that is holding you back, right? I don't know if I said this right. Yeah, but.
No, it's a great answer. I think it's really true as well. I think the limiting beliefs thing is, it's a term often used in the coaching world. And I do, when I talk to coaching clients, about this, you don't necessarily, the term might confuse them a bit, but actually you then explain what you're talking about here. And most people have got some of those. And when you break through those barriers and make them recognize that actually that's just in your mind, there's no reason for you to feel that you actually are held back from X or Y because there's a genuine reason why you can't do it. Probably it's just something that you just don't believe you're good enough to do it, and you've never given it a shot and you've never really pushed for it. No, I think it's a terrific answer. It's really good. What's your career high point, Stephen? What's the thing that most rewarded you?
Yeah, what I'm doing now is pretty rewarding. I feel like so the Ukraine Freedom Project has raised for humanitarian causes about $500,000, and we've gotten about $1.2 million worth of stuff to the front, and that multiple is getting better because we're right now in the process of sending a container of medical goods, pre-owned medical goods, like things like hospital beds and orthopedic equipment. We're sending that to Ukraine. That's about $1 million for the stuff. And so we have now, we've gotten better and better at getting stuff that is donated in kind, as we say, meaning that, people are not giving you financial stuff. They're giving you goods. And so with that, you can take a small amount of money and make a huge impact. And so that's something that we're doing. And more on the advocacy side, because I used to be a chief of staff on Capitol Hill, I've got the relationships, I've got the knowledge of how the place works. And so we've met with something like 70 members of Congress. And so there's not a lot of people that are doing pro-Ukraine work. There's some people that are doing really good stuff, but, we're up at the top. And so I'm really proud of that. And
yeah, so you should be. That's fantastic. It's a great achievement. And for, as you say, for a great cause, it's amazing. I mean, every high's got a low. So what about the low point?
You mean like yesterday? and you sleep and I have 50 things to do. And, and so, yeah, no, I mean, look, there's low points every day, and there's, as I mentioned earlier, Washington is really fun until it's not. And when it's not fun, it's really not fun. And so, everybody has their ups and downs. And my father used to say, everybody gets in the penalty box, and, which is a hockey reference. And, if you break the rules in hockey, then then they put you in a box for a minute or something like that. And I'm fortunate that I haven't had much time in the actual penalty box. Like, I've never been, there's a lot of people that have had in the political sphere that have had serious problems, but sometimes, you just have a down period where whoever you're working for is, if your boss loses an election, you're out of a job in this business, and so, there's just built-in lows. And so what do? I try to maximize the highs and minimize the lows. And yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, as much as anything, right? It's how you bounce back up. If when you're knocked down, it's how quickly you get back up and how sort of springy you are once you're back on your feet. Because as you say, I totally agree. everyone has lows, obviously, and some of the time, if you get completely floored by them, and in your kind of world, it's a great example, actually. If you're, as you say, if in the political arena, whoever you're working for loses, then you're out of a job. That definitely is going to teach you, I think, to be able to absorb the lows better than perhaps people who are coasting along in a world where they don't have to deal with that kind of uncertainty and or that drama when something happens, which I think is an increasingly challenging thing, isn't it, for people now, where job security is less than it was in all sorts of parts of the world of business, the public sector, everything. There's less certainty around that, and therefore taking those hard knocks becomes important to to have an ability to bounce back up.
Yeah, and let me tell you one example that's interesting is that so the rules in the world these days are changing more quickly than sometimes that you can keep up with. And one example was when I first got into Congress, 2007, they changed the ethics laws, and so in 2007, in 2006, you could go to dinner with anybody, you could accept gifts, that sort of thing. And so they decided that was something that was causing a problem. And so they changed that so that you couldn't accept gifts, you couldn't accept dinners, that sort of thing. But there were 27 exceptions to that rule. and so what my ethics lawyer advised me, he said, if you're sitting down and eating with someone, you're probably breaking the law. If you're standing up and eating with someone, you're probably okay. And so, and then here's the other thing is that, I had to raise about $1 million a year from the PAC community, the community of corporations that are active in Congress. And as did everybody in Congress. And so, in 2006, you had to raise $1 million in the PAC community. In 2007, you had to raise $1 million in the PAC community. But if you did it sitting down, you'd go to jail. And so in my world, and I think more in the corporate world as well, there's an increasing amount of rules and regulations that are maybe well intended. But, in my case, it didn't do anything to take the money out of politics. It just set up a bunch of mines for people like me to step on,
Yeah, interesting. And of course, it's competitive as well, right? You're I guess, you're competing at least in part for the same funds, with all of the other members of Congress, et cetera, who are in the same place and who have got to turn around and fight for funding.
And yeah. And listen, if someone has a better way to do campaign finance, again, this is also, you can reach out to your voters. Any member of Congress has 700,000 voters. And so you got to talk to those people, and tell them what's going on, because if you don't, they get their information from bad actors in the news media, and the news media is full of bad actors. And so you got to raise that money. And if someone has a better idea on how to do it, I'd be totally open. But the way it is now, you still have to raise a ton of money. you just have a bunch more ways that they will send you to jail and ruin your life.
Interestingly, do you have any free access to TV and the political parties? So in the UK, what happens? In the run up to the next election, there will be, and a lot of people turn around and switch channels at this point. But what happens is you'll end up with a party political broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrat Party or the Green Party. And they are allowed a certain amount of airtime, which basically hangs on, and it's across all the various mainstream channels, not every channel. But and they're not usually not on at the same time, so you can actually switch to something else. But they're effectively campaign ads for that party, and the amount of airtime they get depends essentially on the representation they have. So, Conservative Party and Labour Party get the majority, and then there are others for the smaller parties, but not the smallest. I mean, there are some that don't get any. But do you have anything like that in the States, or is it all pay?
No, I can't even think of anything that will be analogous to that in the United States.
Oh, wow.
So if you want to get airtime to get your message out, then you have to pay for it. And so there's a huge amount of problems in Americans' political system, and they're just not getting better. I'm super pessimistic about the political system. I'm normally an optimistic, upbeat guy, man. But
well, I mean, let's try and finish on a positive note then, because you were really generous with your time. I certainly don't want to abuse that. What's the most memorable event of your career / life?
Good question. There's been a lot of really good events on my career. So I worked for a guy named Peter Roskin out of the Chicago area, a Republican out of the Chicago area. Really good human and a good friend. And although I didn't know him when I started working for him, and in 2007, in his first election, he won 51% to 49%. And it was one of the highest spending races in the United States. So it was really intense. And we had a series of victories after that I'm really proud of. And one was in 2008 when he got reelected. He was in Illinois, which is Obama's home state. And this was 2008, which was Obama's wave year. And he won 58 to 42 in his reelection. So he got 58% of his district. Obama got 57% in his district, which means that we convinced about 15% of Obama's voters to vote for Peter Roskin, which was a difficult problem to solve. Subsequently, we got him into leadership in the House of Representatives, where he became the number 4 guy in the House of Representatives. And that was a long, complex political problem. So I'm really proud of the work. And also, it's not just the politics, because he was a really good guy, is a really good guy, and was in it for all the right reasons. And we did a lot of really good stuff for America and the world while we're in there. So I look at that, and people are doing good things in Congress, and people are, working hard and doing the right thing as they see the right thing, right? Everybody has got a different opinion on what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think it's such an important point as well, because there's so often the media in particular dwells on the bad stuff, to the extent that I know lots of people now who don't watch the news anymore, because they just go, it's all negative. There's nothing positive. And the reality is there's plenty of positive stuff. There's plenty of successes. There's all sorts of things going on that actually people should be celebrating. They just don't get any airtime. And that's such a shame.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you will never see a newspaper headline that says, everything's great today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't sell papers, right? Or exactly, or create viewers. No, Stephen, you've been fabulously generous. I really appreciate it, and you're a very busy guy, and I know you've had a tough few days. So I'm particularly grateful, and I hope that, as I say, we'll come back and do a revisit when things develop in the US.
I love that. That sounds great, man. Thanks. Appreciate your help.
Thanks very much.